Froeklich, and I am both the Director of Development and Graduate Affairs, and enormously pleased to welcome you to this special event, the presentation of the 2004 Father Norm Choate Distinguished Graduate Award and the annual Graduates Association Lecture. This is an occasion when we celebrate the achievements of our graduates and of our faculty and affirm the values of academic excellence and community involvement that we seek to inculcate as a Roman Catholic institution of higher learning. This is also an occasion on which our president, Michael W. Higgins, usually speaks, generally with great brevity and constraint. Tonight, however, we have given him free rein and sufficient time to explore a subject which promises to be both provocative and timely, spirituality and reason, a strange and potent mixture. But before we get to that potentially inebriating topic, it is my pleasure to announce this year's recipient of the Father Norm Choate Distinguished Graduate Award. This award has been presented for the past 18 years to graduates of St. Jerome's University who have excelled in their commitment to their profession, their community, and the Church. This year's presentation is particularly special because a number of the past recipients of the award are here with us tonight. They are Joe Mancini, Richard and Christine Domenico, Tom Cinconi, Judy Nairn, Brenda Kenyon, Rob Donaldson, and Joan Grundy. I would like to ask these distinguished individuals to stand and be acknowledged at this time. This evening, Dr. Peter Warrion joins this group and has distinguished himself in so many different areas of endeavor that his distinctions defy easy classification. He has excelled as a social activist, as a public servant, as an entrepreneur, as an educator, and as a philanthropist. He is someone who has pursued interests wherever his abundant curiosity leads him, beginning with a degree in sociology from St. Jerome's in 1968. Since that time, he has gone on to study history at the University of Waterloo, receiving his MA in 1972 and his PhD in 1986. He has also pursued postgraduate studies at the Sloan School of Management at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or as we at the University of Waterloo like to call it, the MIT of the South. Peter translates the values that he learned as an adherent to the teachings of Dorothy Day and the Catholic Workers' Movement into protest activities during the 1960s and later into his work in the labor movement, first as the Legislative and Research Director of the United Steelworkers of America, then as the Executive Assistant to the President of the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, and most recently as the Executive Director of the Canadian Steel Trade and Employment Congress. Those experiences and the election of an NDP government in Ontario under the leadership of Bob Rae led to an interest and involvement in public life. Peter was appointed Assistant Deputy Minister of Finance and Chief Economist of the Province of Ontario during the difficult period from 1992 to 1994. For most people, a background in labor and government would not lead with anything like inevitability to an interest in entrepreneurship. But Peter then became a partner and director of Zoomit International Corporation, which marketed networking software until it was acquired by Microsoft in 1999. This lifetime of experiences has led him at last to the Academy. He is currently a senior research fellow at the Monk Center for International Studies and an adjunct professor of political science and industrial relations at the University of Toronto. He also teaches graduate-level courses at Queen's University. And yet, the restless curiosity persists. Peter is currently pursuing theological studies at Regis College in Toronto. Peter is involved as a volunteer with a number of organizations, including the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, and he and his wife Margaret created the Lupina Foundation, a private foundation active in the area of health and social welfare. Together, they also sponsor the Newman Center lectures on contemporary issues within the church at the University of Toronto, and recently donated a significant collection of contemporary art to St. Jerome's, which motivated the creation of an art gallery and meeting room space in Sweeney Hall. When I met with Peter recently to interview him, he told me that Father Norm Choate was one of the most formative influences upon him during his years studying sociology at St. Jerome's. He told me that, quote, Norm Choate had a way to transmit the sociological imagination that was visionary. It seems that the feeling is mutual. Upon learning that Peter was to be the recipient of this year's Distinguished Graduate Award, Father Norm, who regretted that he could not be here this evening, asked me to read the following. Peter, please accept my most sincere congratulations on receiving this award. More than a few undergraduates heard from me. Keep your mind and your heart open to opportunities. In the long run, the biggest surprise will be your own life. Wondrous and unimaginable people, places, work, and gratifications will come to those who hear and understand. That has certainly been true of your adventure. It is thrilling for a former teacher to learn that our time and conversation together has made a difference. I look forward to learning of your new adventure as a theologian. I am deeply gratified that you are receiving this award. God bless and keep you. Our world is in desperate need of people who make a difference. Father Norm. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to ask Patty Tush to come forward and assist me in making the presentation to this year's Father Norm Choate Distinguished Graduate, Dr. Peter Warrian.
Well, unaccustomed as I am to speaking in public, let me attempt a few words of rebuttal to Harry's overly generous introduction. Harry, my mother-in-law actually has a different version of your introduction, which is along the lines of, he's never been able to hold a steady job. And Ken McLaughlin in the back, whose TA I used to be, would reaffirm this general direction. It's a delight to be back at St. Jerome's. I should say at first scan, I haven't spoken to this many people at Waterloo since you all would have been sitting on the floor chanting slogans against the war in Vietnam. That's my previous dominant experience. In fact, I'm surprised that perhaps that some of the older members of the administration aren't here tonight, much like senior executives of companies go to the retiring union president's retirement party to make sure the son of a bitch goes, you know. So anyway, it's a delight to be at Waterloo. And it was a delight to be and an inspiration to be at this institution. Now, we were at this institution in the 1960s, which was a wonderful, effervescent time. I do, first of all, though, want to make a comment in commemoration of Norm Choate. In our university educations, if we are lucky, we will find one or two, probably not a larger number, more than that. I'm sort of a bum of an economist, but counting 1 to 2 is about as far as, that's why I went into software. You only go to 0 to 1. But if we are really fortunate in our university educations, we'll find 1 or 2 professors that are really, and instructors that are really inspirational. I don't think it's 8 or 10. And they will be different, because we are different, and that's why diversity in the university is so important. But for me, Norman Choate was certainly one of those. He was just one classy guy, as all of you know. But in the classroom, he brought it alive. He taught sociology in the grand style. Durkheim, Marx, Weber, Parsons, Mills, etc. And as Harry alluded to briefly, he was able to communicate an inexorable quality of mind that best in C. Wright Mills' tradition was called the sociological imagination. So if there is one aspect that has characterized my inconsistent, largely failing, and erratic career, it has been maintaining the sociological imagination. So if we came away with one thing, and that Norman communicated to us, was a sociological imagination. And he had a magic in the classroom. And as I said, if we have success in the university, if the university or the college is successful with us, we will have some of those moments. And virtually every week in the classroom with Norm Choate was like that. So I can't express in those, other than those few inadequate words, that debt to Norman Choate. Now, what we did with that was something else. This was the 1960s, right? We had Vatican II on one end. We had Woodstock on the other end. Couldn't always tell the difference between the two, nor did we care, all right? So there would be moments of sociological imagination, or not, where four of us are sitting in the coffee shop. You know, I actually went there. The day I came out to defend my PhD, I went back to the same old coffee shop. The Donut Queen at Weber and University is still some various. That was it for a chocolate. My wife Margaret starts rolling her eyes at this point. A chocolate donut and a tea. When we planned the largest protest against war in Vietnam, it was with that chocolate donut and tea. And when I came in to defend my dissertation, it was the same chocolate donut and the thing. Well, one night in the coffee shop, we're sitting there, say, well, gee, we really don't like this war in Vietnam. What could we do that would really bug the Americans? And somebody said, well, let's get people to dodge the draft. What do you mean dodge the draft? So yeah, there's an extradition treaty between Canada and the United States, and if they come to Canada, there's no comparable offense that can't be exported back. The seed of this little idea, the rest they say was history. It transformed Waterloo as much as anything else, and probably the largest brain, whatever the reverse of a brain drain is, the rest is brain flow north. Like prior to the Bush election, that is. We're about to benefit. Economists will start to measure these things after the fact. But it was moments like that of inspiration. On the other hand, on another day, I said to the Ray, I think the social contract thing will work. Well, not everything works out, you know. Some ideas work better than others. But, again, in our education, a great institution has great instructors. And it has been an immense benefit of this college, to disproportionate to its size, to generate a series of great and inspirational teachers. And that is the core experience that we could ever hope to have, and all we could hope for our children to have in education. And finally, it was, as I say, the era of both one of my daughter's angriest moments as a teenager, we all have these moments with teenage daughters, which says, you had everything. You had the civil rights movement. Yes, I was involved in that. You had the civil rights movement. You had the war in Vietnam. You had Woodstock. This is her particular moral horizon. But it was also the time of Vatican II. And of a Catholic college, not just frozen to that time, but those things that a Catholic college but most transmit that are impermeable and enduring is a moral horizon. And it was a moral horizon that we came away from that with, a moral horizon that I came away from this college with, and for which I'm forever grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's a cliche to say that someone needs no introduction. And those who know him will confirm that Michael Higgins vehemently disdains and reviles the cliche. It follows, therefore, that he requires an introduction. Michael Higgins is the President and Vice-Chancellor of St. Jerome's University and a leading commentator on matters religious and spiritual in the national press and broadcast media. He is the author of Heretic Blood, The Spiritual Geography of Thomas Merton, and The Muted Voice, Religion and the Media, and is the co-author, with Douglas R. Letson, of the best-selling Power and Peril, The Catholic Church at the Crossroads. He and Dr. Letson have also written a number of other books, including The Jesuit Mystique and My Father's Business, a biography of His Eminence G. Emmett Cardinal Carter. Michael is a regular commentator on both CBC Radio and television, on CTV, and in the Toronto Star and the Record, on issues pertaining to the Vatican and the contemporary Catholic Church. He is currently working on a CBC Ideas program to be aired in the coming year called Stalking the Holy, The Politics of Saint-Making. As a leading academic, media commentator, and the president of a Roman Catholic liberal arts university, Michael has taken a special interest in the role that our personal religious beliefs and spirituality play in the exercise of our public and professional responsibilities. It was that interest that led him to initiate plans for a conference on the neglected subject of Pierre Elliott Trudeau's faith and spirituality, a conference which has just had its proceedings published in a new book entitled The Hidden Trudeau, The Faith Behind the Politics, which includes the text of his own presentation, Defined by Spirituality. And it is that interest which animates the subject he has selected for this year's graduates' lecture, Spirituality and Reason, a Strange and Potent Mixture. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Higgins.
Thank you, Harry. I'd like to thank the former Director of Development and Graduate Affairs. I wish you well in your future, Harry. I realized listening to Peter tonight that we could have saved a lot of money at the graduates' dinner and just had chocolate donuts and tea. We'll have to make sure that we do that the next time round. I can tell you that the relationship of spirituality and reason plays an important role in the life of tonight's Father Norm Choate Distinguished Graduate Award winner, Dr. Peter Warren. Let me give you 3 instances that underscore the truth of this observation. Many years ago, Doug Letson, my predecessor, brought me and Dave Augustine, the then Director of Development, to meet Peter. That was the first time I was to meet him. And Doug said, as we were heading off to this Japanese restaurant, he said, now this will be an experience unlike any other. You better brace yourself for Peter. So I walked in and we sat down on the table, and Peter said to me, not even hello, first of all, he said, Martin Heidegger studied under Husserl, was for a time a Jesuit, and became a member of the Nazi Party. Sister Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein, studied under Husserl, was a Jewish convert to Catholicism, and perished in the Holocaust. How do you explain this? So I went to a different restaurant and cursed Letson all the way home. But it introduced me to the searching and clever mind of Peter Warren. And although I did attempt an answer, I'm not altogether sure it was particularly satisfying, but it was nonetheless an introduction to how he thinks and the importance he attaches to thinking and to spirituality. Another instance is we are both members of the Pilgrim Club, which was founded by the Chancellor of this university, Richard Gwynne, and meets frequently in Toronto at either Massey College or now the Newman Chapel. And there we have an opportunity on a regular basis to see Peter's remarkable curiosity and interest in the interface of religion, spirituality, the political life, and contemporary thought. His support for Newman Chapel lectures and for Regis College has already been indicated by Harry. And I suppose the last instance I remember is turning on TV recently and seeing him with Steve Paikin of TV Ontario talking about Stelco and the situation in Hamilton with the union leader. And what struck me most about it was the energy. Well, the strange appearance with the jacket that didn't match the shirt and everything else. But other than that, other than the sartorial bewilderment that it created, it was the remarkable lively engagement with its interlocutor. And it's not often that you see a puzzled face on Steve Bacon. But with the puzzle, there was amazement. So he seems the right one, in a way, as a recipient of the Choate Award, to build a talk around the role of spirituality in the university, because it clearly matters to him, and because his life now is in no small part centered around the academy. Does spirituality, then, have a place in the academy? Is this really the right question? Should we not rather ask, what is the consequence of its exclusion? But first, let's define the term spirituality itself. It is a term that defies immediate, exact, and precise definition. Everybody in this room would have a definition of spirituality. Many years ago, when I first began my current job, Harry Froelich and I went to a seminar given by some high-powered fundraiser out of Chicago. It was in Toronto, and he kept talking about spirituality. And he would say things like, "This room is full of spirituality." And "I'm full of spirituality." Well, he was full of it, all right. But it wasn't spirituality. But he caught on to the term. It was a buzzword. It meant for him marketability, amiability, susceptibility. But it didn't mean, in any traditional sense of the term, spirituality. But he knew this was a good term. This was a neutral term. Everybody wanted to be spiritual. Well, they might not like religion, and they might balk at something so crass as a capitalistic approach to fundraising, but they'll like spiritual. Who's going to fight against spirituality? Not long after that, while in Washington at a series of meetings, I managed to make it over to the Union Station. They have their Grand Central Station, or whatever it's called, which is a marvelous place. It's now largely peopled or peppered with various boutiques and bookstores and whatnot. And I decided to look up under spirituality, under the rubric spirituality, what are the kinds of things that were listed there? Well, of course, it was very difficult to find anything like Teresa of Avila, Ignatius of Loyola, Thomas à Kempis. What you found were, of course, books on tarot cards, palmistry, all in various forms of channeling. And the premier book in the spirituality section, actually was a magazine, was called Bonkers. Bonkers, question mark, a working spirituality for your pets. Well, as absurd as it was, and it was a page right out of Evelyn Waugh's novel, The Loved One, you had to marvel at the fact that here we had this extraordinary term, now so diluted of any significant kind of meaning, that it could mean, in fact, anything. I saw that once again, most recently in the CBC coverage during the Summer Olympics, when one of the interviewers, speaking to one of our athletes, said, "You are just energized by spirituality." And what the interviewer meant was, you're energized by a passion to win, by a determination to bring all your training and your discipline and your camaraderie and your patriotism together in one wonderfully fertile and fruitful moment. But she used the word spirituality. It's used again and again. So it's not surprising that people will then say, what the heck does it mean? Well, I'm not going to exhaust its various and possible meanings, but I will give you what I understand what it means, by first of all telling you what it does not mean. It is not a commodity. It is not the latest fad. It is not to be purchased, exchanged, bartered, or trivialized in any way. It's like wisdom. We do not possess it. It possesses us. Although we have spiritual handbooks, manuals, and guides that help us to deepen our spirituality, in the same way that we have similar tools to enrich our investment lives, explore our sex lives, help us perfect our household and workplace widget skills. I've got to get that book. And assist us in better understanding the expanding puzzle that is our children. We know that our spirituality is a life project and not a term assignment, age-specific obsession, or divertissement. Spirituality, to my mind, is organic. It's rooted. It's communal, yet personal, expansive and not insular, historical and yet contemporary, living, not fossilized or atrophy. And the university, a place like this, and our sister university across the creek, need such qualities. Not in its corridors or curricula particularly, but it is in its inhabitants, its faculty, staff, and students. One is never too young to be spiritual, any more than one can be too old to be wise. Just as one never ceases to be a sexual being, one never ceases to be a spiritual being. They are both constitutive of our very definition as human. So how to identify, then, some core characteristics of a meaningful spirituality in the university? Before I do so, let me say something about Donald Nicol and his essential notion of the scientia cordis. Donald Nicol is a former historian, taught at the University of California in Los Gatos, I believe, or Santa Clara, somewhere near there, for many years, was a Balliol graduate from Oxford, was a convert to Christianity, came from a village in Yorkshire. He was the only one of his generation, the only one in his family who was ever able to make it to university. Saw war action during the Second World War, traveled widely in Russia and India, became a polyglot, and in his later years was served at one time as director of the Tantur Institute outside of Jerusalem, and returned to Maggie Thatcher's England to identify with the poor and the unemployed, because he thought it was an important place for him and for his wife to be found. He came here in 1989 and gave a stirring lecture, the Devlin Lecture, as part of our St. Jerome's Center. It was a powerful moment for me. I spent some time with him. He wanted to be introduced to several of the Mennonites and wanted to see St. Jacob's and several other areas in town because of his commitment personally as a pacifist. We did that. And I remember one particular restaurant where we ate, and he was very animated and talked at great length, not like me in small sound bites, but at great length. And I remember, too, his enormous length or height. He must have been 7.5 feet tall. He wound himself around the table like a boa constrictor. And so filled with a kind of living wisdom. It was a marvel to be in his presence. He was the kind of teacher Peter was talking about earlier when he was talking about Norm Choate. Because he lived what he talked about. It meant enormously. It meant an enormous amount to him. He came up with an idea called the scientia cordis, or the science of the heart, which became a foundational principle in his writing as an historian of religion. Let me quote from it, very briefly. It is clear, says Nicol, that the spiritual seekers are not content with examining merely the external features of other traditions or their statements of belief, but rather they penetrate to the very heart of them. They find that by which those in the tradition live. And they share in it, without taking it upon themselves to make comparisons, knowing that one can only compare what lies on the surface. They share in the worship and prayers, the pilgrimages and festivals. They rejoice with the others at their feasts and mourn with them at their funerals. One of the most moving accounts of such a quest is to be found in Hindu and Christian in Vrindavan by the German Catholic Klaus Klaustermeier, who spent 2 years in Vrindavan, the playground of Krishna. The seeker, he says, and I quote, would not want to have anything more to do with academic dalliance or a science of comparative religion, behaving as if it were stood above all religions. He will also not want to know anything more of a certain kind of theology that works without presuppositions and pleases itself in manipulating definitions and formulas and forgets about what is human, the main concern. No, he will be more and more pulled into what is called spirituality, the real life of the mind. Spirituality, the real life of the mind. I wanted to see a famous man in Benares, a sagacious philosopher feared by many as a merciless critic of Christian theology. I had my own reason for paying him a visit. He was polite, invited me for tea, and then mounted the attack. I let him take his fill without saying a word myself. Then I began to talk about the things I had begun to understand within the dialogue, quite positively Christian. We got into a sincere, good, deep discussion. He had intended to send me away in 10 minutes. When I left after 2 hours, he had tears in his eyes. If we insisted on our theologies, you are a Christian, I as a Hindu, we should be fighting each other. We have found one another because we probed more deeply towards spirituality. End of quote. Nichol goes on, in the light of this statement by Klostermeier, we catch a glimpse of how one might penetrate to the heart of other spiritual traditions and achieve a real scientia cordis, science of the heart, on which all of them converge. They converge for the very good reason that they are all in contact in one manner or another with the very same reality. It is such a scientia cordis, or science of the heart, which I wish to say something about for the rest of my writing. And indeed, that's precisely what he did. Spirituality has a place in the academy because, in my view, it abhors the foreclosure of experience, the constricting of vision, the diminishment of the ardent pursuit of knowledge. It lives in dread of what William Blake called single vision. Spirituality, then, is not something we package in a course. It is not something that we market as a product of our institution. It is not something to be found in various quantities in our faculty, staff, and students as if it can be weighed, assessed, and measured. Rather, it penetrates all that we do, suffuses our thinking, directs the way we interact with others. It is a living reality, intangible, probing, restless, questing. It is the heart of university life and mission. It's about the life of the mind. And now to these 4 core characteristics. Number 1, continuity with tradition or framework of meaning, a recognizable universe of shared symbol, myth, and analogy. That's important. Let me quote something for you from an interesting article by Eamon Duffy, the distinguished professor of Christianity and history at Cambridge University in England, and many of you may have seen him on television with his saints and sinners portraits over the centuries of the popes. He's a remarkable man. And in a very interesting article called The Mass Bells of Maremma, The Waning of European Christianity, he has this to say, and I quote, De-Christianization is, of course, a familiar feature of modernity, though the encounter with its more extreme expressions can still surprise and shock. I was stunned recently by a story told by a Cambridge colleague who went to a local jeweler to buy a silver cross for a goddaughter's birthday. "Certainly, sir," said the helpful young shop assistant. "Would you like a plain one, or the kind with the little man on it?" Such breathtaking disengagement from even the basics of the Christian story is startling in an ancient university town, with its daily ringing of the bells of parish churches and college chapels. Now, Eamon Duffy is not inclined to pessimism. He understands the resilience of religion and of the Catholic Church in particular, a major focus of his own study, and he is himself a Catholic intellectual. But he entertains no illusions about the decline of a common narrative or framework for discussion. Northrop Frye, many years ago, alluded to the fact that in our culture, it will be a very short period of time until our children have never even heard of Zeus, never mind the rest of the gods or the Greek myths. Frye's anxiety over the future of Greek mythology is nothing compared to contemporary anxiety over the disappearance of the Bible as a working framework of understanding. You would be surprised the number of people who don't know Samson or Delilah, or to say nothing of the minor figures. And I was reminded just a few years ago in a class that I taught about 6 years ago when I was vice president. I had a wonderful class brimming full of excitement and energy, young students. It was a course on the religious quest. I had not taught it before, but Professor Michael Bird had asked me to take it over for the summer, and I did. And I had all kinds of interesting books on it, looking at complex quests for meeting, Eddie Hilsum, Anne Frank, Simon Weil, Thomas Merton, naturally, a whole array of extraordinary figures on quest. And I remember one particular time, a young woman raising her hand to me well into the course and saying, but I have one question that I want to ask you. And I said, "Sure, of course, what would you like to ask?" She said this. She says, "It's Jesus Christ, but his parents aren't Mary and Joseph Christ. So what happened to the surname?" And I thought, is this a joke? This is a joke. But I looked around the room, and you could see them nod. I said, "That's a good question. I've always wanted to know the answer to that." So I thought, as we often do, good pedagogue that I am, this is a teaching moment. So I took the occasion and explained what Christ meant, Christos, what the term meant, why it was used. Now, the question itself is a perfectly reasonable question in a way, but in another sense, it beggars the imagination in a way, the same way that who is the little man on this silver cross? Forces us to keep in mind that de-Christianization, post-Christianization in a way, is a challenge for all of us, rooted in a specific spiritual tradition. So, continuity with the tradition or framework of meaning, a recognizable universe of shared symbol, myth, and analogy. Number 2, a creative conjunction of stability and temerity, bringing both together. It seems like a strange thing to do, but here's a quotation from the eminent biblical scholar, Robert W. Woodruff Professor of New Testament and Christian Origins at the Canada School of Theology, Emory University, Luke Timothy Johnson. There's a very interesting passage that I think encapsulates a good deal of my observation tonight. And believe me, it's not nearly as negative, as nostalgic as it might first strike you. Listen what he says. "The implicit argument embedded in much scholarly and popular work is that historical Orthodox Christianity is little more than a power-hungry conspiracy. That prejudice is reinforced by a widespread preference among many well-educated Christians for the universal over the particular, for the spiritual over the religious. With only the most rudimentary knowledge of history and theology, even otherwise well-educated Christians become the perfect target for the ersatz spirituality and scholarship hawked at Borders or Barnes and Noble. End of quote. I think that's absolutely true. But, it is essential that one not encase or enshrine the tradition in such a way that it does not respond to the present challenges. A meaningful spirituality is not mired in nostalgia. The growth sometimes of the ecclesial movements in the Roman Catholic Church is a hearkening to a time of easy certainty, and that, in the end, is not a productive way to move forward in modern understanding, though it may be, at an emotional level, quite understandable. So creative conjunction of stability and temerity. You stand still, you have a context in which you observe, but also you take risks. You can't take risks if you're not rooted in something. Otherwise, what's the risk about? How can you take a leap if you're not rooted in something? So the root, the leap, the rootedness, the temerity of imagination and spirit can only occur within a context of meaningful stability. And I mean meaningful, not the same as, shoring up the status quo or the ancien regime, or saying that there's got to be, this is what truth means, and this is only what truth means, and it has a univocal meaning only, and Thomas Aquinas and the schoolmen understood it, and it's our responsibility to communicate this as the philosophia perennis. Nothing ever changes. Untrue. Things do change, and they change constantly. But that doesn't mean we have to be uprooted, impermanent, cast adrift. There's all kinds of danger in that. Thirdly, empathy and openness. The empathy and openness that was provided by Klostermaier in this wonderful exchange with the Hindu scholar. He came together in the context, most probably I could imagine even in an ashram, sitting down, anticipating that within a couple of minutes they would come to verbal blows, but they don't. And why? Because undergirding all of this is a fundamental empathy, openness to actually hearing what the other says. The interlocutor isn't the enemy. He's not looking into the face of negation. He's looking into the face of a fellow pilgrim, engaged in a spiritual journey with all of its risks. That's the scientia cortis. So, number A, or number one, continuity with a tradition or framework of meaning, a recognizable universe of shared symbol, myth, and analogy. Number two, a creative conjunction of stability and temerity. Number three, empathy and openness. And the final one, and probably a strange one coming from me, humility. Thomas Merton had a wonderful correspondence with Edward Deming Andrews, author of a major work on the Shakers, an 18th century millenarian group called the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Coming. They had all kinds of different communes, we would call them now, little towns, marvelous architecture, marvelous buildings, peppered throughout parts of New England, but principally Pennsylvania and the state of Kentucky. He wrote a work, Andrews that is, called Shaker Furniture, which was published posthumously, but had a perceptive introduction by Merton, who was fascinated by the Shaker experiment, by their paradise vision and artistic purity. Merton, a Trappist monk and visionary poet, was struck by the Shakers' humility, a prophetic antidote to the fanatical certainty of our times. Let me just quote briefly from that. Marvelous book. He says, the Shakers, this is Merton, remain as witnesses to the fact that only humility keeps man, this is exclusive language time, it was in the 60s, keeps the human in communion with truth, and first of all, with man's own inner truth. This is in the letter to the author. He then goes on subsequently, about a week later, in a very important and revealing passage that says as much about this Trappist monk as indeed does about the Shakers that he's examining. The law of all spiritual life is the law of risk and the law of struggle and possible failure. Some of us only learn tolerance and understanding after having been intolerant and absolute. In a word, it is hard to live with a strict and sometimes almost absurd ideal like the Christian message, and the ambivalence involved can be tragic or it can be salutary. The role of humility, if you like, an understanding of failure as salutary, as an epiphany of grace, as an aperture which allows us to grow, to see through God's forgiving and embracing love, is another signal mark or sign of a meaningful spirituality in the university. Let me now conclude with a quote from Nichols' 1989 Devlin lecture delivered here in Siegfried Hall and published subsequently in Grail, the journal we ran for so many years, as Holiness, a Call to Radical Living. This is right at the end of his talk. The truth is that every ideology of our time refuses to face up to the agony of being human, which consists in the fact that from the very beginning there is implanted in us a longing for unconditional love, for agape, which we ourselves are not only powerless to supply, but whose nature is infinitely beyond anything human beings can even imagine. So every plan, however radical, to change the human condition, whether by moving mountains, or by genetic engineering, or by giving away all one's possessions, even one's body, all of that will prove to be nothing unless we receive the Holy Spirit, who alone has the power to change human hearts. And it is through repentance that the Holy Spirit empowers us to exchange our broken, self-contradicting human nature for the fullness of unbroken participation in the divine nature. Nothing, absolutely nothing else, could be so radical. Spirituality in the university doesn't call us to a continued series or act denying, negating the value of reason and exploration, of assessing, of evaluating, of weighing, of exploring and of debating. After all, spirituality is about the very life of the mind, in no small part. But these core characteristics that I've outlined this evening remind us that spirituality doesn't just have a decorative role to play in the university, something that is seen as anomalous, a peculiar feature or quirk of a particular professor, a subsection or genre of possible exploration by professors of religious studies, but is in fact something that defines the very heart of the academy. Mind speaking to mind, heart speaking to heart, trying to make sense, being open and vulnerable. The university thrives in the context of competition. We live by being first in the rankings. Professors compete among themselves, against even themselves and their own record. Students are quickly drawn into the energy, into the very engine of competition and success that defines the university. Emphasis is placed on productivity, the winning of awards and positions. These are not without their value. A university, an intellectual academy, is a hothouse of competition, and that is reasonable, and it is to be expected. But it doesn't exhaust the mystery and the meaning of a university, a place where there is an exchange not only of ideas, a tentative exploration of complex matters, a humility in approach to the truth, but also the realization that these things are pursued at the subjective level, at the level of the individual existent, that knowledge is not just political, knowledge is personal. Knowledge liberates, and it is the role of spirituality in the university that in a sense serves as an antidote to prevent this kind of idolatry that allows us to see the university only as a place that grinds out achievement and forgets in the process human growth and wisdom. Now that is a spirituality for a university. Thank you.
of my employment here tonight, whether it's appropriate for me to conduct this last section. But Dr. Higgins has agreed to take questions if anyone would like to pose any. Yes.
Absolutely. No, it's a good point, Jimmy. Having the surrounding oneself with the paraphernalia and the public signs or symbols of a particular religious tradition as a way of defining your own world in which you operate and guaranteeing your kind of surety and a kind of security and stability in a turbulent world is religion precisely in the way you've described it, is religion as a crutch. That is not, in my sense, religion in the sense, or spirituality in the sense of being both stable and calling and temerarious. A working universe or narrative where you can make allusions, draw on a commonly shared, not ideology in a particular case, but in a commonly shared, say, working myth of understanding, is enormously helpful within a community, not just a community of faith, but a community that has been grounded on or has been nurtured in no small part by a living tradition. Now, maybe not living in all those corridors and all those places any longer, and it may in some instances have lost its very credibility or its integrity of meaning, and that is true. And for others, exploring this will be an essential feature of their scholarly lives, and that is true as well. Now, what I think I'm lamenting, what Duffy clearly does, and what several others do, is not necessarily a decline of faith per se, but that the discourse itself, the language, the universe of shared symbol, meaning, analogy, that has kind of crumbled, and so it's made it very difficult to find a common narrative. And so you can't presume anything in a classroom or even part of a conversation. I remember many years ago when I first read The Seven-Story Mountain, which was Merton's foundational autobiographical text. He went on to write, as you probably know or may know, several autobiographies after that. But in that, there's this wonderful illuminating moment when he's talking about Professor Brahmacari, who was a Hindu philosopher teaching at Columbia University in New York. And Merton at the time was doing work on William Blake, and he would later do doctoral work on Gerard Manley Hopkins. And Merton was very keen, having read a work by Aldous Huxley on ends and means, and understanding something about mysticism and the religious sensibility and all this kind of thing. So he went to Brahmacari to ask Brahmacari, tell me more about the East. I want to know more about Sikhism and Hinduism and Buddhism. I want to know the religions of the East, because clearly the traditions out of which I come are bereft, they're empty, they're dead. I want nothing to do with them. Brahmacari didn't jump at this as a proselytizing moment. He jumped at it as a teaching moment and said, go and learn the tradition out of which you come, and then come back, and the serious dialogue can begin. Interestingly enough, that's exactly what Merton did. He went back and for the first time seriously appropriated the tradition out of which he had come,
only partially and marginally knowing, steeped himself in the text, and then came back as one of the major interlocutors between Christianity, one of the major figures in communication or in dialogue with the religions of the East. So treasured was he in his wisdom and insight that people like Suzuki in Japan acknowledged him as knowing more about Zen Buddhism than any Christian alive. This was not only in one area, but in many areas as well. The Dalai Lama, who acknowledged his extraordinary capacity to do what Nico talks about in terms of empathy, entering into the heart of this other faith. But how could he do that? He could only really do it because he took the advice of Brahmacari, went and learned about his own tradition first. I think it's in that sense that I mean it. But you're quite right. It can be a shell game. It can be an empty game. One could be surrounded with all kinds of charts, holy pictures, holy cards and everything else, and be bereft of any kind of credible spirituality.
Yes. Jesus himself said, I'm not a good Protestant, although I can't quote the chapter of a verse. But didn't Jesus himself say, why do you fear? Go out into the deep.
I suppose that, yes, well, Mary, I think that's probably part of the temerarity thing. Yes, I do. In fact, John Paul II very interestingly uses that phrase, not that phrase, but several others in the synoptic accounts of being not afraid, as almost a leitmotif running through his writings, that there is about any kind of meaningful Christian spiritual witness, and I'm only talking in this particular context of Christian spirituality, or of course many others, in which you do take the risks. Yeah, you do take the risks. Is that your hand up, Harry? No, you cannot have your job back.
Holding it down. Any other questions?
Well, thank you.
When I opened my comments this evening, I said that we were here to celebrate our graduates and our teachers. And I think this evening has been a wonderful opportunity for those of us who work here, for those who study here, for those of you who know us simply as the Catholic University associated with the University of Waterloo, to get a full, concrete understanding of what those words actually entail. The distinctions just go on and on. I just found out, for example, that Peter Warrian has been granted from the Oxford University in the United Kingdom a fellowship in economic geography to start in 2005, and the status of international distinguished scholar. So I can only say that we do, however, get credit for giving him the title of distinction first. We may be smaller than Oxford, but we are nimble. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's always a great pleasure to have these occasions when we can celebrate our graduates. As an institution of higher learning, we usually see our graduates for the last time at convocation as they go off and follow up on their lives. It's always great to get them back together, to hear their memories of the place, and to hear what they thought of the time that they spent here. Thank you for coming out and joining us in this celebration. Good night.